You're very welcome to the Murder One Festival as part of the Dublin Book Festival. And my name is Dil Wickremasinghe, and we are in the beautiful surroundings of the National Library of Ireland here on Kildare Street. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Irish author of the highly acclaimed novels Only Ever Yours, Almost Love, and Asking for It, Louise O'Neill, to talk about her latest book, After Silence. You're very welcome, Louise.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to first very quickly tell everybody what the book is about.
Sure.
And then we'll get into the
meat
question.
of it.
Yes, the meat of it, exactly. But as you can see, a well-thumbed copy of After Silence.
I love that. I love a good cracked spine.
Yeah, it's been cracked by myself and my missus, because we both ended up reading it while we were camping in West Cork.
Oh, wow.
So,
I mean, you really couldn't have chosen a better place to read it.
I know. So, After the Silence is set on a small island off the coast of West Cork, Inisharoon, where a glamorous family called the Kinsellas have set up an artist retreat. The youngest Kinsella son, Henry, has married a local woman, Keelan, and it's during her 36th birthday party that a wild storm engulfs the island, cutting them off from the mainland. The next morning, the body of a young woman is found, and that is Nessa. No one can get off the island or get on the island, so it's someone on the island. So 10 years later, the murder of Nessa Crawley still haunts the Irish people, and so a team of documentary makers from Australia come to Ireland determined to find out exactly what happened. And After the Silence is a story about love and fear, rumors and whispers, and it's all about the secrets we keep and the lies we tell ourselves in order to survive.
Oh. That was a good intro.
I know. So this is a huge departure for you, Louise.
Yeah.
It's a psychological thriller.
Yes. I mean, you know, it's funny. I suppose I'm not really confined by the idea of genre. Like, you know, my first novel was dystopian. I wrote 2 contemporary novels, and then I wrote a fantasy retelling of The Little Mermaid. So this is a psychological thriller, and it's my first psychological thriller. But I don't know. I mean, while I was writing it, I felt like it was a really good fit for me as an author, because I think with some of my other novels, you know, particularly maybe Only Ever Yours, where it was this drip feed of information, and there were secrets, and you're trying to figure out what this world is and who these people are and what they want and what their motivations are and what secrets they're keeping. And actually looking at it, I thought, wow, there's some elements of that are actually very similar to a psychological thriller. And I don't know, I think, you know, I'm someone who gets bored really easily, and I like a challenge. So my boyfriend gets really nervous whenever I say that. He looks a bit kind of like, oh God, what's going to happen to me? But I think that, so yes, I just wanted to just challenge myself. And, you know, with a psychological thriller, I think, you know, the idea of pacing is so important, making sure that it's a page turner, sort of having a lot of cliffhangers at the end of chapters so that the reader wants to, you know, keep reading until, like, you know, 5 a.m. And so I don't know, it just, for me, I was like, this is something that I want to try.
It certainly was a page turner. Because I was saying, we were camping around West Cork, and when you started reading the book, you were like, oh my gosh, sure, Louise is only in Clonakilty. She's just around the corner. And here
Surprised you didn't turn up and say hello.
No, could be shopping at Scally's, and there you are, you know, buying the donuts, you know. But yeah, no. So let's talk about West Cork for a second, because it's set in West Cork, and I think it's really important for you to represent not just Ireland, but West Cork in particular.
I mean, I hope I don't know if it's the most flattering portrayal, you know, this
Murder.
movie about, yeah, exactly, no one will ever come again. But yeah, I mean, I suppose, you know, it's interesting sometimes when you think about people who write about Ireland, I think a lot of the time that they have lived abroad or they've spent time abroad. Whereas I think that for me, you know, I obviously grew up in West Cork. I wouldn't say that it felt like a natural place for me to exist as a child or a teenager. I always felt like I was sort of straining a little bit by the limitations maybe that were being put on me by other people and other people's expectations of who I would be and what I would achieve or what I could achieve, you know, just because of who my parents were or what my family, you know, who my family was or what my history was. So, you know, I moved to Dublin first of all, and I travelled a lot. You know, every summer, you know, instead of going home, you know, first I went to Spain, then I went to South and Central America, I went to India, I went to New York, and then I moved to New York after I finished college. And I think it was actually in New York where I think I really first started to get a sense of myself as being Irish, because I suppose when you grow up somewhere, you never really feel. I mean, I was going to say you never really feel other, but then I think in a lot of ways I did feel like an outsider. But I think it's definitely when you move abroad and your identity as an Irish person and those kind of the stereotypes of what Irishness mean are really presented to you, and I think you have to sort of grapple with that and look at that. And
is this who I am, or
yeah,
is it somebody else's assumption of who I am?
Yeah, exactly. But actually, in a strange way, I felt like I became, and I think you see that with people. You know, my aunt has lived in Australia for 30 years, and I think has a very strong sense of sort of patriotism, and you know, which I think you do almost begin to identify with it even more strongly. So I think that when I moved back home after I left New York and I had the idea for my first novel and I came back to Clonakilty, I think as an adult you're able to look at somewhere where you're from and actually appreciate the sense of belonging, the sense of community, the sense of knowing, I suppose, who you are and your place in the world, which is interesting because that was something that I found so restrictive as a teenager, and then I could really appreciate it as an adult. And the funny thing is that for someone who had spent years running away from the country and wanting to live in a city, I think I realised that when you're brought up, you know, particularly like we live very close to Hachette Ireland, and I always say I was like half mer child, you know, half human child, and I think that there's a part of you that will always crave the sea. There's a part of you that will always crave the wildness.
Hence a Little Mermaid.
Yes, exactly. It was like my dream, basically, to do that rewrite. So I think that I just love West Cork, and I think that, you know, while this is a murder mystery, I think that the beauty and the wildness of West Cork is something that I really wanted to evoke in the book as well. Like I feel like, you know, when that cliche about New York being the fifth character in Sex and the City, I think West Cork is like a really major character in this book too.
Yeah, people who want to come visit West Cork after reading this book, it's absolutely stunning. And let's talk about the inspiration for After the Silence. In West Cork, the podcast played a part. But before we talk about that, you know, when Sophie Duplantier was murdered, you were 11 years old. So tell me a little bit about that time. What was it like for you at that time? You know, growing up in West Cork, you probably had freedoms that children nowadays, my children are probably never going to have. And how did that impact on you? Because it certainly, you know, it's impacted you to a point to write a book around it, you know?
I mean, we were afforded an incredible amount of freedom. I do think my parents were very young and were just desperate to get rid of us at any opportunity.
Get out!
So I remember we met these people in Spain and we befriended their daughter and we wanted to have a sleepover. And we were all packed in my pajamas. And then my mom said, I really probably shouldn't let you do it. I have just met these people today. And I was like, no, Mom, I don't. Like looking back, like laughing. But she was only in her 20s and was, I think, just trying to like figure it out as she went along as well.
Sorry, the parent in me was like, what?
Yeah. No, to be fair, she didn't in the end, and we were raging. We were there with our pajamas going, come on, Mom. Yeah, so I think that we were afforded an enormous amount of freedom. You know, we left in the morning and you know, just would come home that evening whenever we got hungry to be fed, basically. Yeah, and I think that, I suppose what was strange was you grow up in an area like that, you know, where you're told this is very safe. You know, we look after each other, we protect each other. This is a very safe environment, and you know, our doors weren't locked. You know, they were like, I suppose, particularly this was the 90s, so even then, I suppose the idea of crime was just non-existent. And then when the murder of Sophie Duplantier happened, it was just incredibly shocking. And I think, you know, a lot of authors are really fascinated, you know, if you look at C.S. Lewis or William Blake, you know, the idea of the loss of innocence. And I don't know, I think it's very hard to pinpoint that to one event, but I do think if I look at that moment, I think there was an unraveling of it, because I think it was this idea of the outside world encroaching upon our world, you know, where things like, you know, murder just did not happen. And I think it was just, it really shook everyone. And I think it wasn't just the fact that this was so shocking and terrifying, but it was also a sense of shame, because when you grow up in an area like that where tourism is so important, you almost develop like a split personality where one part of you interacts with the locals and, you know, your own people in one way, and you sort of remold your personality when you're dealing with blow-ins and the tourists.
This place is great.
Yeah, and it's that kind of, you know, Céad Míle Fáilte, and, you know, the and just smiles and welcomes and being extra charming, and, you know, I think because it's almost like a performance, I think, in a way, and then to have someone who was an outsider, had come here because they, you know, thought West Cork was beautiful and they felt that they were safe there, and for something like this to happen while they were here, there was a sense of, I think, of shame, and especially, I suppose, with the way that the media, particularly the global media, I suppose, the portrayal of Ireland and portrayal of West Cork, you know, and the police were, you know, the guards were backwards and they were fumbling and they were clod hopping, and, you know, I think that was, there was a real embarrassment about that as well, and I think that when I listened to the West Cork podcast, you know, which was this 13-part series, an Audible series dealing with this,
up again,
100% dealing with this unsolved murder, I think there was a part of me that was, like, I binged it in one day, and there was a part of me really hoping that these two journalists would have figured out what happened, you know, that I think that Sophie could have peace and her family could have peace, but that the people of West Cork could have peace as well. So I think there was a reason why that podcast had such a particular resonance for me. And afterwards, I think I couldn't stop thinking about it, because I suppose it wasn't necessarily the case itself, but what it said about us as a people, you know, the spectre of the foreigner, you know, the dreaded Sassenach, the Englishman. I think what that said about the post-colonial tension between Ireland and England, you know, like there was a lot of sort of residual anger there, I think. Yeah. And I don't know, and I suppose the way that we exile people, that we think have transgressed these unspoken rules, and I think how we do it, like the way we do it, is with silence. And I don't know, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then, of course, you have two documentary makers coming in to this community with their English accents, asking questions, you know, like trying to uncover secrets that some people don't want to be uncovered. I just think, to me, it seemed ripe for, like, creative exploration. I was like, oh, this would make a really good book, and here we are 2 years later.
It's amazing, because it really kind of captures, you know, just what you went through and what that community went through and is still going through. You know, so very, very, very beautifully written. And let's just talk about Keelan for a moment, because you know, I'm training to be a psychotherapist. You know, so both my wife, who's also a psychotherapist, we were reading this book. You could really see your own awareness of the human psyche, because you know, as you're a feminist, and all your books tackle very thorny issues: consent, sexual violence, and now domestic abuse. I feel you're trying to save the world or change the world one book at a time.
I don't know about that. I mean, it's actually really interesting with Keelan, because what I'm really finding it fascinating this time, because, you know, obviously with asking for it, I made a very deliberate choice that Emma, the victim of the group rape, and that she would be what we would call an unlikable character. It was like, I just think it's really important to challenge the idea of the perfect victim, you know, that we can only have sympathy for victims of sexual violence if they are white, middle class, nice, polite, you know, yes, virgins, basically. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I just I really thought it was important to challenge that. And then with Almost Love, which was my first adult novel, which dealt with this very kind of toxic relationship, again, I think with Sarah, I wanted someone who, you know, had, you know, she'd lost her mother at a very young age and had never dealt with that grief and was behaving in ways that were she was really acting out and sort of lashing out at the people around her and acting in ways that were very selfish and sort of monstrous. So I could understand, you know, why people would say that she was unlikable. But after a round of reviews, which were 800 words and 600 of them were devoted to how much the reviewer could not stand the main character, I made a deliberate decision. I said, I am going to make the next character really likeable, really sympathetic. So I did loads of work with Keelan. And what has been so interesting so far is already I'm getting feedback. Another trademarked Louise O'Neill female character, an unlikable female character. You just want to shake her. And I just think, my God, isn't this the perfect example of, well, why don't these women leave? It just is actually beyond me. I just am so surprised already by that kind of reaction, and I felt really frustrated with her, and I couldn't understand why she was making the decisions that she was, and I just was like, wow, this is... I probably should have been prepared for it, but I really wasn't. I was really surprised. Yeah, I think it is. I think it's the discomfort that we have, and I think it just reinforces so much of that harmful rhetoric around, you know, that we talk about when we speak about victims of domestic abuse.
Why didn't you just leave?
Why don't they just leave? Why do they put up with this? I wouldn't put up with this. I wouldn't, you know, if that was my husband, well, I wouldn't tolerate that. And I think it's really interesting because so often when we talk about when we look at cases of unsolved murders, let's say where the prime suspect is a man, and if he's in a straight relationship, you know, so often we say, God, why doesn't this woman just leave? And like it's I suppose the uncanny sort of parallels between those two.
Saying, why did he kill her?
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It's just, but again, I think it's so much of living in a patriarchal society where we do put so much responsibility on women, you know, in the same way with victims of sexual violence. Like, were they asking for it? How much did they have to drink? You know, how short was their skirt? Like, why did they go to the party? Why did you go to that hotel? Why did you go to that bedroom? So it's just, it feels kind of frustrating in 2020 I wish, again, I think I'm surprised by how surprised I am in a way, you know, because I've been doing this work for such a long time that you would think that I would be used to it. But I don't know, and I think, because with Keelan, you know, that in her previous relationship, she is the victim of physical abuse, and then and then she trains and
as a counselor. And she works in a
she does, and she works in a refuge.
Yeah. And then she finds herself in yet another marriage where she's like this kind of this abuse is much more, you know, insidious. You know, it's so manipulative, and it's, you know, gaslighting and all that. You know, she's like, you're not feeling this way. You know, so but what I took away from it is like, this is a perfect example of, you know, you could be a therapist. You know, you could have done years of training and still you're only human.
And that's the whole point. And I think so much of the time, like, you know, I've been in therapy since I was 17, and it is something I'm really fascinated by. And I often say that when I was a teenager, I wanted to be an actress, and then I became a writer. And I often think that my third act will be that I'll become a therapist. Yes! Genuinely, I'm so fascinated by it. Yeah. But I do think that there's a similarity between all of those jobs, in that you are trying to understand the human psyche. You're trying to understand why another person behaves the way that they do, like the choices that they make, you know, even if they're very different to what yours might be. And I suppose empathy and compassion and understanding, I think, runs through like the veins of all of those three jobs. But, you know, definitely, I know when I started, I think there was this sense of, well, you know, this therapist is perfect and she knows everything, and she's, I mean, I was 17, so, you know, but like that she's really wise. And I think, I remember one day that she said something that I thought was, I can't even remember what it was now, but I thought, oh, that's not right. And I was so turned off by it. I didn't want to go back. I really felt almost repelled by her, because I had held her up as being this paragon of virtue who was going to lead me through this and cure me. And now, because she had shown like a chip in the armor, I was like, well, this woman is useless to me. And like, you know, it was just very black or white. And I think it is that, as you said, that understanding that, you know, the therapists are human too. And I suppose with Keelan, and I suppose with many of us, is that we do understand now that physical abuse is wrong. I think that people are much less likely to dismiss that as, oh, that's a private family matter, or, you know, that's not really any of our business. I think people are like, no, this is wrong. You cannot treat someone like this. Whereas actually I think the problem with coercive control, which is a persistent pattern of
finally there's laws against that.
Yes,
in Ireland, finally.
January 2019
right.
they were, and we've just had our first conviction in 2020 in Donegal, but there's still a huge lack of understanding around, as I said, like it's a persistent pattern of controlling or threatening behavior. But it might be emotional abuse, it could be gaslighting, it could be physical, it can be financial, and it can be sexual. And actually, you might find that a little, if it's like, oh, my husband is just in charge of the finances, he's just better with money than I am. So, he has my wages and then he gives me, so you mightn't see that as abuse, or, he really, he doesn't want us to have children, so he's taken my pill away, but it's just because he wants to have kids and he loves me. It's much harder to sort of identify that.
Bruises.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There are no broken bones, there are no visible bruises. It's much more difficult, not only I think for the people around you to identify it, but often it's really difficult for the victim. And I think the problem is as well is that, particularly with gaslighting, where you have people who they will tell you that your grasp on reality is failing, and they will tell you that you can't trust yourself and you can't trust your instincts. And you become more and more isolated, more and more dependent on your abuser, and it just becomes this really vicious cycle. And I think we see that with Keelan, where when people say, look, I felt really frustrated with her decisions, and I think, well, Keelan has come to a point where she thinks that the only person that she can trust is Henry, the only person who loves her, who understands her, who will do anything to protect her is Henry.
Like she feels that she trusts Henry before she trusts herself.
Yeah.
Like he has managed to help get her to doubt herself over years and years of manipulation.
And it's so insidious. And the thing is that particularly in the beginning, Keelan's almost complicit in herself. Like sees this as him helping her. She asks for that help. And I think that by the time she realizes that maybe this isn't healthy, it's too late. It's too far gone. And it's very sad.
Wrapped up in it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the problem, is that when people say, again, I wouldn't do that, I actually think the thing is that you don't know what you would do. And I think for most of us, we're really so afraid of our shadow side. We're afraid of the darkness inside us, and we're actually afraid of what we are capable of doing in order to protect ourselves, and more importantly, sometimes to protect the people that we love.
And the fact that you're talking about this issue in the book, because I think all the other books have been such, you're a role model. You are. There's pressure with that. But there's young women growing up in Ireland who are going to pick up this book, and hopefully, by hearing Keelan's story and hearing about what happened to Nessa, that it might make them a little bit more aware when they're in a relationship and they're like, hang on, is this happening to me? Am I being gaslighted here? Is this an abusive relationship? Because I don't think these topics are still not talked enough about.
No, I would agree. Even though I have a few friends who were like, I feel like I can't trust anyone now after they read the book. I'm lying in bed and my husband is next to me and I'm sort of like staring at him like really suspiciously. But I think, actually with After the Silence, I think what I really wanted to do was to make sure that, like, first and foremost, that it was a psychological thriller. First and foremost, that it's the sort of book that you could pick up in an airport, and, well, if we ever get into airports again, when you're going on your holidays and you just want something, I don't know, that you just want something kind of gripping to read. And because I think that a lot of the time with my books that they were sort of pigeonholed as being issues novels. And I think that for me, I was always like, no, I think my books are really...
much more than that.
Yeah, but I just always thought they were really accessible, and I always just thought they were like a good read, and people always said, when I sit down with one of your books, I read it in one sitting. And I think with this book, I really just wanted to make sure that first and foremost, this is a psychological thriller. It hopefully is gripping, it's a page turner, and then, but I suppose to me, it kind of married, like, I have a very commercial sensibility, and I think it married that with the fact that I was like, but I also return to themes and motifs that I am eternally fascinated by, like just beauty and glamour and wealth and gender politics and abuse, and I suppose navigating the world in a female body and trying to, I suppose, look at those things while not sacrificing the fact that the story has to come first. So that's why I think I say with this that it was it felt like a good fit, you know.
Yeah, because you're absolutely right. You still want people to pick up the book and read it.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted as well, I wanted men to read it. I think that I felt like so often, you know, I mean, asking for it was probably, you know, you would maybe see 30% men and 70% women. But, you know, in general, I feel like when I give talks or when I'm speaking at events, you know, it's primarily women. And sometimes I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here. And it would be difficult, like sometimes you go into schools and definitely the school visits where it's an all-boys school are more difficult, but sometimes you nearly feel like
that's where you need to be.
Yeah, because you know that's where I think are the conversations sometimes that need to be had, because so often we frame these things as women. You know, we frame them as women's issues. You know, we frame domestic abuse as a women's issue, and the thing is that I mean, firstly there are male victims, and secondly, you know, you have children who are growing up in households that are rife with abuse, and there are boys and girls in that as well, and I suppose and to put it boldly, like the majority of perpetrators of physical abuse and of emotional abuse are men. So if how can we frame this as a women's issue if they're the ones who are doing it? And I suppose because of all of that, I'm like, this needs to be something that we tackle together, because it's a global, like we talk about like coronavirus being a global pandemic. This is a global pandemic.
Been
1 in 3,
centuries,
you know, 1 billion women across this planet are dealing with this issue every day. 1 in 3. And I think that's why, you know, when I look at a book like this, I'm like, okay, let's put a cover on it. This is a psychological thriller. This is like, my dad loved it, you know, and I was, even though to be fair, he loves all my books. I think he might just love me, but anyway.
That's a good one.
But actually, it was funny because he said it's like the books, because he loves like a thriller, and he said it's like the books that I normally read, like when I go on, like when he goes on his skiing holiday, he's like, it's like the books that I bring on my skiing holiday. He said, but you're still in there. He said, I can still see. He said, I can hear your voice. He said, he said, it's still you. And he said, he was like, I think, you know, I mean, I thought, which was the perfect way, actually, I think, of putting it.
That's beautiful. And what's the response been from male readers?
Well, again, I mean, so far it's been primarily female, but it seems to be like, I will say that like they do seem to be responding, I think, really well to it. And hopefully, I suppose, even with the packaging of it, like it was funny when we first started, I said to my publisher, I said, I don't want you to mention the fact that it's about domestic, you know, that there's coercive control in this. Like, I want you to...
There's a little picture of a woman on the cover as well.
Yeah. And I said, because I just think that this is so much of the problem, as I said, about this being framed as a woman's book and women's issues. And it can feel very frustrating at times.
And polarizing.
Yeah, you know, and exactly. And I think that, but it, you know, it's been interesting because as soon as the interview started, it was the first thing people were talking about, and I was like, okay, this is how it's going to go. But I think initially it was that attempt, I suppose, just to present it as this is a psychological thriller. This is glamorous, and you know, like the glamour of the island. You know, these incredibly wealthy people. These amazing parties. I remember when Marion Kesey was one of the first people to read it, she said, I know this isn't what I should be taking away from
this, but I love the parties.
I really want to go to it. And she's like, she doesn't even, you know, she hasn't drank in like 20 years. And she was like, I just really want to go to one of those parties. And I said, so do I, but I think we'd be in the corner going, we're definitely not cool enough to be here.
So funny. You know, you don't feel you're cool enough to go to one of the parties that you have written in your book. So
maybe I would have been cool enough in my 20s, but definitely not in my 30s. Those days are gone.
I have a few questions actually from the readers that have put in their questions as part of the Dublin Book Festival. So Alice O'Sullivan says, what do you do to wind down after a day of writing crime fiction?
Yeah,
that's
a good question. Yes, I do swim a lot. You know, I will say that with this book, I was researching for 6 months, which would be much more than I would ordinarily do. But I just wanted to read as much as I could. I wanted to speak to as many people as I could, speak to survivors. And just, I think, you know, I went to Cape Clear a bit, and, you know, I just think I really wanted to have a very clear sense of it by the time I started writing. And the research was very difficult. You know, I would come away from, and I'm, you know, I mean, you're a therapist, so I think...
Good to know that you're in therapy.
Yeah, it was. It was good to be able to have those conversations afterwards. And you'd feel kind of precious, because I think while you're doing the interviews, you know, you're really trying to, I think, maintain a sense of, it's actually quite selfish if I cry in this situation, because then I'm making this about me rather than bearing, you know, witness to this person's story. But I really did feel very close to, because some of the stories are just unbearable, and you just look at the
empathy.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. No, you're right.
And therapists as well. I find myself saying we, even though I haven't started my client work yet. You know, therapists are moved when even though it's somebody else's story, but as human to human, you connect. It's like you know what that suffering, what that must have felt like. So and it's also releasing. Otherwise, you'll end up carrying it.
Yes, yeah. No, I mean, that does make sense. I suppose it's just trying in the moment, I suppose, to not feel like you're making it about yourself, because they were so brave and so vulnerable and just so honest with me, and really sharing, I think, just, I suppose, their worst days, you know, like the worst things that have ever happened to them. And to do what I felt, to do it, I suppose, in service of a book, you know, like I just felt like they were being so generous with me, you know, like just so incredibly generous. Because really, like, what, you know, a book isn't, you know, it's just a story. It's not that important in the grand scheme of things, you know, but I just felt like it was, as you said, just the generosity actually of spirit that they were willing to go there with me. So you would come home, and Marie Mulholland, who's this amazing woman at the Women Against Violence Project in West Cork.
Marie Mulholland.
Oh, she's amazing. Isn't she amazing?
Very vocal lesbian activist. Yeah,
I love her.
Yeah.
And you know, she would be so kind, and she would, you know, text or email and say, look, I hope you're okay, and I would just be sort of, you would feel flattened by it, actually, because I think it's you know, I think so much of the time we live our lives and we try and live them in bubbles, because if you really started thinking about every issue, you know, if you started thinking about homelessness, and if you started thinking about people starving and in this war, like it just, and I think that there's a chip of ice nearly in all of us. I think that sort of ability to try and block out as much as we can just to sort of survive our daily life, because otherwise it would just feel almost overwhelming.
You just curl up in a corner.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it was being very much confronted with, I suppose, the reality of what other people's lives look like, you know, particularly as I didn't grow up with, there was none of that in my immediate family anyway, and I've never been in an abusive relationship. And I think it's actually, when you look at the statistics, when you do the reading, when you talk to these women, you think, actually, I was just lucky. I was just really lucky, because actually the likelihood of either having grown up with it or experiencing it is so high that it's almost strange that I haven't. And I think when you're confronted with that, and that I suppose the idea of the world or the bubble that you live in is burst in that way, it is confronting. It's very uncomfortable, and I think that discomfort is important. But so I think actually the research was the hardest part, whereas actually when I sat down to write it, it just seemed to almost flow onto the page, and in a way that I was able to maintain an emotional distance from it, which I hadn't been with other books. Like, asking for it felt like it was taking blood from me every time I sat down with that book. Maybe it's because I have
boundaries.
I was going to say maybe it's because I have personal experience of sexual trauma, but also maybe it's because I have better boundaries now, and it's my fifth novel, and I'm, you know, in recovery, and I'm in a much healthier sort of headspace now. But I did find the writing of it that I was able to leave it, and you know, I'm in a very different sort of stage of my life. You know, I'm in a serious relationship, and I think there's a part of that where you can't, and maybe you feel like this with, you know, you have a wife and you've got kids, that you can't bring it home. You know, that there's an element of having, of having to have those boundaries between, and having to have that division between your work and your personal life.
But good boundaries is a good indication of good mental health. No, I just wanted to come back because you said something about when you're doing the research, and you said it's just a book in the grand scheme of things. But I just think you must have done a huge service to the women you spoke to, because they felt heard. The fact that they're going to be able to pick up this book and feel, my story, I contributed some, some information to this book, is going to make them feel seen and heard, which is, let's face it, the most intrinsic part of being human. So
I hope so. I really hope so.
And I need to ask you, when are you going to train as a psychotherapist? Yeah. Because I think it'd be amazing.
Give me another like 10 years, I think. But definitely it's something I would love to do. Actually, I mean, to the point where like my father has to say to me sometimes, you have not trained as a therapist. Like you have not trained as a therapist. Please stop psychoanalyzing me. And I'm like kind of sitting there with like my notebook and pen and going, I don't know, Dad.
Listen, I started training when I was 45, so there's plenty of time.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's one of those professions, kind of the later in life you come to it, the better it is. Because I always say you have to date enough basket cases before you can actually do it. Because that's how I say it. And I call myself a basket case myself. Now, Marie Byrne has a question for you. Have you any tips or advice for a first-time crime fiction author?
Oh, wow. I think, to be honest, it's the same as writing any book. Before I started writing, I really wished, or I really hoped, that there was a secret, you know, and if I could just find out the secret, if one of these best-selling authors could just tell me the secret, then I would be able to sit down and write a book. Whereas actually it is just, you just have to open up your laptop and actually start writing, and you have to be, I think, quite disciplined with that. And like I find, I'm always a little bit slow to give writing advice because I think everyone is so different. And you know, like I look at one of my best friends is an author, and she will write until 5 a.m. and then I get up at 5 a.m. to write. So sometimes we'll text each other like as she's going to bed and as I'm getting up.
Shift change.
So I think it's just like her brain is, she's like, this is when I'm most creative, and I'm like, oh, I'm most creative in the morning. And then other people, you know, I like to write like every day, 1,000 words every day, whereas then I know other people who are better in bursts. So, you know, maybe twice a week they'll write 3,000 words. So I think it really is about, first of all, figuring out when am I at my most creative, and whatever time of the day that is, really trying to carve out, I suppose, just some time for yourself, for your work, to really prioritize it in that way. And I suppose specifically with crime, like I suppose I would have read a lot more psychological thrillers over the last few years, which isn't a genre I think I would have traditionally read because I am a bit of a scaredy cat and I hate things that are like have too much tension. But actually, I think the reason why
sleep at night.
Yeah, no, that is it. Honestly, no, you've no idea. I read a vampire book there. I think it was a friend of mine had written it about 6 months ago, and I finished at 12:30, and I really needed to go to the bathroom, and I was too scared to go to the bathroom, so I was like, I'm just going to go to sleep. It'll be fine. It'll be totally fine.
I saw the fall the other day, and I was like convinced there's someone in my house now.
See, it's terrifying. Yeah. But I think over the last few years, there's been amazing female authors who are using psychological thrillers to really address like issues that impact women. So let's say Leanne Moriarty with Big Little Lies, and Erin Kelly with in He Said, She Said with rape culture, and Megan Abbott, and like Liz Nugent is amazing. So I think that if you're interested in writing crime, you know, read the very best of crime. And then I think after that, maybe pay attention to pacing. That's just so important and not giving too much away, I think, in the beginning. I feel sort of like a fraud because this is my first psychological thriller. So I feel sort of like I have imposter syndrome giving other people advice on how to write one. So.
Because I know you felt that because we were at FemFest together at the beginning of the year, which feels for me like it was years ago.
God, yeah. Those were very innocent times.
Yeah.
We had no idea what was coming.
And in an event like FemFest, you have so many young women who come up to you and say, "Oh, Louise, you're amazing." Yeah. And then, because you said we all experienced imposter syndrome. I felt it this morning. It's like, what am I doing coming here and interviewing Louise? What do I know? You know. Yeah. But you have good days and bad days as an author as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the thing is about being an author is that it's so solitary. So it's just you and, you know, your laptop, and then, you know, the inevitable or eventual book. And then I think when you meet people and they're talking about how much the work has resonated, it's quite a jarring, it is quite a jarring experience because you go, oh God, someone else has read it. You know, it's that sort of sense of, because it's you and the book, and then your editor will come in, and, you know, there's a few other people maybe that will have read it. And then I think it's that sense of it being read widely and other people having their own experience with it or interacting with it in a way. And it can just feel very bizarre, actually.
Very exposing, no?
Yes, that's exactly the word, very exposing. So I think when you're in, and I mean, I think there must be a difference, because at least if you're performing, you're used to that sort of interaction. You're used to getting instant feedback.
If
you're a comedian, yeah, exactly.
Die on your butt.
Exactly. If you're a comedian, if you're a musician, if you're an actor, you're feeding off that sort of feedback from the crowd. Whereas it's actually almost overwhelming when you're doing a signing and there's 100 people there and they all want to talk to you about what the books have meant to them or how they've interacted with them. And you just think, God. It's honestly, the only way I can describe it is it feels as if I'm in my writing room in my dad's old fleece and a pair of pajamas, and a line of people are coming in to sort of talk to me, and you're like, what are you doing here? So it just feels very strange, but lovely, genuinely so lovely and flattering and humbling, but just I think a little bit strange.
Yeah, because this is the thing, because I think with books, it's so intimate. And you're carrying the book with you, and it's, wherever you are in your life, especially issues that are so sensitive. A lot of people reading this book could have experienced domestic abuse themselves, and they're coming to book signings, so the element of transference as well there, so it's trying to, I'd say you get that a lot, where people actually say, oh, this happened to me, and do you have any advice?
It's very,
so if you become a psychotherapist, you can just give out your card. Make an appointment.
It's interesting with signings, especially if you're doing a panel where there might be 4 people on the panel, and let's say we all probably have a similar enough size of a queue, but I'm always there an hour after everyone else has left, because each person will have a story, and I think the thing is then you begin to realise how prevalent these issues are, because it feels like almost every woman has a story, or every, there's a lot of men as well who would have been victims, and I think there's one part of me where you're like, this is so humbling, to put a piece of work out into the world and to think that it might actually be of comfort or of help, or I don't know, feel illuminating in some way, is actually, I think, beyond what I could have ever imagined or ever hoped for when I started writing. So it just feels unbelievably humbling, and I just feel so lucky and also really honoured that people would feel able to share that with me. But I suppose I'm not a trained therapist, and I think I'm always so aware of my responsibility, not to do no harm, I suppose, or, not to say something that might
trigger.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just trying to be very careful with that. And then also coming away, and I would have definitely before walked away from signings and felt very hollow. And I think the problem for me was that so often when I felt hollow, I would have used my addiction, I would have used my eating disorder to fill myself up, to comfort myself. So I would have really have spent maybe a few hours doing this and then gone back to my hotel room and been like, I can't bear this, and I think it's really been I think I'm in a much better place now, I'm in full recovery and I'm doing really well. So I think it's trying to sort of find that balance where that you're there and you're able to bear witness and you're able to hear these stories and you're also able to say, I believe you. That's because I think that's genuinely all they want you to say, but to come away from it and to be able to take care of myself in a way that feels, helpful, like taking a bath or just doing something that feels more like self-care rather than self-harm.
There you go. You are changing the world one
book at a time.
No, I
really am not.
You totally are. Yeah. You totally are. You totally are.
I really want to write. I'm always like, God, I would love to write a romantic comedy. I really would, and I love those sort of books. I love a really funny book, or I love something that's really charming. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this. And then as soon as I sit down, it just comes out so dark, and I'm like, what is wrong with me?
You're just a mirror.
Yeah.
You're just holding up a mirror to the world.
A friend of mine actually who had just read this book texted me and she said, I'm trying to remember now, she said, I often marvel at how sunny and warm you are, but then how you're able to sort of access such darkness. And she said it's like two entirely, whenever I pick up your book, she said it never feels like I'm reading what I know of you. So she said it's like two completely different.
That's us.
Different people.
We all have lightness and darkness within us, and I think that's half the problem is people realize, oh, he would never do that, or she would never do that, because we can all be capable of absolute 100%. Everything. Yeah. We've run out of time, Louise. I can literally sit here and talk to you all day. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, especially after reading the After the Silence. For those of you watching, you can get your own copy of After the Silence from the Dublin bookfestival.com website. And yeah, and Louise, thank you so much,
Dil.
Absolutely humbling speaking to you, and we change the world one book at a time.
Oh my God, I really am not, but thank you.
Louise O'Neill, talking about After the Silence. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Dil Wickremasinghe.